Genesis chapter 14 verse 1. And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel king of Shinar, Arioch king of Elazar, Chedorlaomer king of Elam, and Tidal king of nations. Genesis chapter 14 verse 1 sets the stage for a significant event in the early chapters of Genesis, commonly known as the War of the Kings. This verse introduces 4 kings and their kingdoms: Amraphel, the king of Shinar; Arioch, the king of Elazar; Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam; and Tidal, the king of nations. Amraphel. The name Amraphel is not found elsewhere in the Bible. However, some historians and scholars suggest that he may be identified with Hammurabi, the famous Babylonian king known for his law code. Arioch. Like Amraphel, the name Arioch does not appear frequently in the Bible. Some scholars identify him with Eriaku, the king of Larsa, a city in southern Mesopotamia. Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam, is the dominant figure among the 4 kings mentioned. He leads the coalition of kings and plays a significant role in the events that follow. Elam was an ancient kingdom located in what is now southwestern Iran. Tidal is referred to as the king of nations. The specific identification of his kingdom is uncertain, as the term nations could indicate a diverse group of nations or tribes. Genesis chapter 14 goes on to describe how these kings engaged in warfare against 5 other kings from the region of Sodom and Gomorrah. The war results in the capture of Lot, Abram's nephew, who dwelled in Sodom. This event prompts Abram to gather his trained servants and allies and embark on a daring rescue mission. As the narrative unfolds, Abram achieves a remarkable victory over the kings, securing the release of Lot and recovering the possessions that were taken. Afterward, Abram encounters Melchizedek, the king of Salem, who blesses Abram and acknowledges the Most High God. Genesis chapter 14 verse 1 serves as an introduction to this historical account, setting the stage for the ensuing conflict and the subsequent actions of Abram. It highlights the geopolitical context of the region during that time, providing insight into the prevailing powers and their interactions. By studying this passage, readers can gain a deeper understanding of the ancient biblical world and the challenges faced by individuals like Abram as they navigated through complex political landscapes. Genesis chapter 14 verse 2. That these made war with Bera king of Sodom, and with Bersha king of Gomorrah, Shinab king of Admah, and Shemeber king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. Genesis chapter 14 verse 2 is part of the larger narrative of Genesis chapter 14, which tells the account of the war between several kings. Let's explore the context and significance of this verse. Historical context. Genesis chapter 14 takes place during the time of Abraham, who was known as Abram at the beginning of the chapter. The chapter starts by introducing several kings and their territories. These kings were involved in a conflict known as the Battle of the Kings. The war, in Genesis chapter 14 verse 1 through verse 2, it is mentioned that Bera, the king of Sodom, and several other kings engaged in warfare against 4 other kings, Bersha, Shinab, Shemeber, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. The kings of Sodom and Gomorrah were part of this alliance. Sodom and Gomorrah were 2 cities known for their wickedness and depravity. In Genesis chapter 13 verse 13, it is mentioned that the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. The kings of these cities were involved in the war described in Genesis chapter 14. Significance. The significance of this verse lies in its portrayal of the conflicts that surrounded Abraham during his time in Canaan. Abraham's nephew, Lot, who had settled near Sodom, was captured during the war. Genesis chapter 14 verse 12. This event leads to Abraham's subsequent rescue of Lot, which showcases Abraham's loyalty and courage. Foreshadowing. The mention of the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis chapter 14 foreshadows the future destruction of these cities due to their wickedness. In Genesis chapter 19, we read about the account of God's judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah, resulting in their destruction. Overall, Genesis chapter 14 verse 2 provides a glimpse into the historical context of Abraham's time, introduces the conflict between the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah with other kings, and sets the stage for subsequent events in the narrative. It also highlights the imminent judgment that awaited the wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Genesis chapter 14 verse 3. And all these were joined together in the vale of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea. This verse is part of the narrative of the conflict between 4 eastern kings and 5 kings of the cities of the plain, including Sodom and Gomorrah. The passage describes how these kings joined forces in the Vale of Siddim, also known as the Salt Sea or the Dead Sea. To understand the significance of this verse, let's examine the context and explore its theological implications. Context. In Genesis chapter 14, we learn that a coalition of 4 kings led by Chedorlaomer had conquered several territories, including the cities of the plain where Lot, Abraham's nephew, resided. When the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah rebelled against Chedorlaomer, they were defeated, and Lot was taken captive. Abram, later known as Abraham, received news of Lot's capture and mustered his trained servants, numbering 318, to pursue the captors. In a daring and successful nighttime attack, Abram rescued Lot and his possessions, defeating the eastern kings. Significance and theological implications. Geographical location. The verse mentions that the kings were joined together in the Vale of Siddim, which is identified as the Salt Sea. The Salt Sea is another name for the Dead Sea, known for its high salt concentration. This geographical reference adds authenticity to the biblical account. Symbolism of Vale of Siddim. The Vale of Siddim was a fertile region where Sodom and Gomorrah were located. However, it was also a place of moral corruption and wickedness, as later verses in Genesis reveal. The association of this place with the wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah highlights the contrast between the moral degradation of the cities and the righteousness of Abram, who comes to their rescue. Divine intervention. This verse sets the stage for the account of Abram's heroic rescue of Lot. The gathering of the kings in the Vale of Siddim provided an opportunity for God to intervene and deliver Lot through Abram's bravery. It demonstrates God's sovereignty over human affairs and his ability to use human agents to accomplish his purposes. Foreshadowing. This passage foreshadows future events in the Bible. The rescue of Lot anticipates the theme of deliverance and redemption that runs throughout Scripture. Additionally, Abram's victory over the eastern kings can be seen as a precursor to the Israelites' conquest of the Promised Land under Joshua's leadership. In summary, Genesis chapter 14 verse 3 provides geographical context to the account of Abram's rescue of Lot from the kings who had captured him. The verse also carries theological significance, highlighting the moral corruption of the cities in the Vale of Siddim and the divine intervention and deliverance orchestrated by God through Abram. Genesis chapter 14 verse 4. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. This verse is a part of the account of a war that took place in the time of Abraham. It provides historical context regarding the political situation in the region during that period. To better understand the significance of this verse, let's explore the surrounding verses and delve into the broader context of the chapter. Genesis 14 describes a conflict between 4 kings and 5 kings. Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam, led an alliance of 4 kings against 5 other kings who had rebelled against him. These 5 kings included the kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela, later known as Zoar. The 4 kings led by Chedorlaomer defeated the 5 kings and plundered their cities, including Sodom and Gomorrah. Verse 4 specifically mentions that the 5 kings had served Chedorlaomer for 12 years before rebelling in the 13th year. This information highlights the period of subjugation that the 5 kings endured before attempting to assert their independence. From a biblical perspective, this account provides historical background and sets the stage for the events that follow. It also highlights the significance of the city of Sodom, which plays a pivotal role in the narrative of Abraham and the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Genesis 14 serves as a precursor to the introduction of Melchizedek, the king of Salem and a priest of God Most High, who blesses Abraham and receives a tithe from him. This chapter also emphasizes the military prowess of Abraham as he leads a successful rescue mission to recover his nephew Lot, who had been taken captive during the war. In terms of broader themes, this verse touches on the consequences of rebellion and the shifting political landscape. The rebellion of the 5 kings against Chedorlaomer resulted in a conflict that affected the entire region. The subsequent events in the chapter highlight the interconnectedness of individuals and nations, as well as the importance of alliances and military power in ancient times. Overall, Genesis chapter 14 verse 4 provides historical context and sets the stage for the events that follow in the chapter. It serves as a reminder of the consequences of rebellion and the dynamics of power and politics in the ancient world. Genesis chapter 14 verse 5. And in the 14th year came Chedorlaomer, and the kings that were with him, and smote the Rephaims in Ashtaroth-Karnaim, and the Zuzims in Ham, and the Emims in Shaveh-Kiriathim. This verse is part of the account of a war involving various kings in the region. To better understand the context, let's look at the broader narrative in Genesis chapter 14. In Genesis chapter 14, we learn that a coalition of 4 kings, led by Chedorlaomer, waged war against 5 other kings, including the king of Sodom. These events took place during the time of Abram, later known as Abraham, and Lot, his nephew. Verse 5 specifically mentions the conquests of Chedorlaomer and his allies. It lists 3 groups of people who were defeated. Rephaims. The Rephaim were a group of giants who lived in the land of Canaan. They were known for their great height and strength. Ashtaroth-Karnaim was a city associated with them, located in the territory later allotted to the tribe of Manasseh. Zuzims. The Zuzims, also known as the Zamzamims, were another group of people living in the region. They were considered Rephaim-like and were defeated in Ham. The location of Ham is not definitively known but is thought to be in the vicinity of the Dead Sea. Emims. The Emims were yet another group of giants residing in the region, specifically in Shaveh-Kiriathim. Like the Rephaim and Zuzims, they were known for their stature and strength. The city of Kiriathim is believed to have been located east of the Jordan River. This verse highlights the military campaign led by Chedorlaomer and his allies, resulting in the subjugation of these 3 groups. It serves to emphasize the power and conquests of these kings during that time. In the broader narrative, we see that Lot, who was living in Sodom, was captured by Chedorlaomer's forces during the war. When Abram heard about Lot's capture, he gathered his trained servants and pursued the enemy kings, successfully rescuing Lot and recovering the spoils taken from Sodom. Genesis chapter 14 verse 5, therefore, provides historical context within the narrative of Abram's encounters and displays the power dynamics of the region during that period. Genesis chapter 14 verse 6, and the Horites in their Mount Seir, unto El Paran, which is by the wilderness. Context: Genesis 14 describes a conflict between several kings in the region during the time of Abram, later called Abraham. The passage mentions the involvement of the Horites and their location in Mount Seir and El Paran. To better understand this verse, let's explore the background and significance of these details. The Horites were a pre-existing people group inhabiting the land of Canaan before the arrival of the Israelites. They are often associated with the Edomites, who descended from Esau, the brother of Jacob. The Horites were known for living in mountainous regions, particularly Mount Seir, which is located in modern-day Jordan. They likely occupied the region east of the Arabah Valley. Mount Seir, mentioned in Genesis 14 verse 6, refers to a mountain range extending across modern-day Jordan. This area later became the territory of the Edomites. The region is characterized by rugged terrain and rocky landscapes, offering natural fortification and protection. Mount Seir became a significant geographical feature in the biblical narrative, often associated with the Edomites and their relationship with the Israelites. El Paran, mentioned in Genesis 14 verse 6, is believed to be a location near the wilderness of Paran. The exact location of El Paran is uncertain, but it is generally understood to be in the southern part of Canaan, close to the Sinai Peninsula. Paran is known for its association with the Israelites during their wilderness wanderings after the Exodus from Egypt. Lessons from Genesis 14 verse 6. While Genesis 14 verse 6 provides geographic details about the Horites, Mount Seir, and El Paran, the verse alone does not convey a direct moral or spiritual lesson. However, it does serve as a reminder of the historical and geographical context of the biblical narrative. It emphasizes that the events described in Genesis occurred in specific locations and involved various nations and peoples. As you continue reading Genesis 14, you will discover the broader story of Abram's involvement in the conflict between the kings and the rescue of his nephew Lot. This chapter showcases Abram's bravery, leadership, and trust in God's guidance. The events in Genesis 14 also set the stage for the subsequent encounter between Abram and Melchizedek, the king of Salem, who blesses Abram and demonstrates the priestly role. In summary, Genesis 14 verse 6 sheds light on the historical and geographical context of the events in the chapter. While it may not directly provide a spiritual lesson, it contributes to the overall narrative of God's work in the lives of His people and the fulfillment of His promises to Abram. Genesis chapter 14 verse 7. And they returned, and came to En-Mishpat, which is Kadesh, and smote all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites, that dwelt in Hazezon-Tamar. Context: Genesis chapter 14 is a chapter that describes a battle between several kings. It begins with a war between 4 kings against 5 kings in the region. Among those involved are the kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, and their neighboring cities. The kings of Sodom and Gomorrah were defeated, and their cities were plundered by the invading armies. Location: Genesis chapter 14 verse 7 mentions 2 places, En-Mishpat, which is Kadesh, and Hazezon-Tamar. En-Mishpat, which is also known as Kadesh, was a place located in the southern region of Canaan, near the border of Edom. Hazezon-Tamar is believed to be the ancient name for what later became known as En-Gedi, a city located near the Dead Sea. Conquest: in this verse, it is mentioned that the invading forces smote or attacked the country of the Amalekites and the Amorites who dwelt in Hazezon-Tamar. The Amalekites were a nomadic tribe that lived in the region, and the Amorites were another people group inhabiting the area. The invaders conquered and defeated both groups, possibly as a consequence of the war between the 4 and 5 kings. Historical significance: this verse highlights the conflicts and conquests that took place during ancient times in the region of Canaan. It provides insight into the military engagements that occurred and sheds light on the presence of various tribes and nations in the area. Such accounts can help us understand the historical context surrounding the events and people mentioned in the Bible. Spiritual application: while this verse primarily focuses on historical events, we can draw spiritual lessons from it. The battles and victories described in Genesis chapter 14 verse 7 remind us that even in times of conflict and uncertainty, God is sovereign over the affairs of the world. It is essential to trust in God's protection and guidance, knowing that He can bring deliverance even in the face of overwhelming odds. Additionally, this verse serves as a reminder that God's plans and purposes often involve human actions and interactions. He works through historical events and uses imperfect individuals to accomplish His will. It prompts us to consider how our lives can be instruments in God's hands to fulfill His greater purposes. Remember to read the surrounding verses and explore the entire chapter to gain a comprehensive understanding of the context and significance of Genesis chapter 14 verse 7. Genesis chapter 14 verse 8. And there went out the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, the same is Zoar, and they joined battle with them in the vale of Siddim. Genesis chapter 14 verse 8 is part of the larger narrative of Abraham and his encounter with several kings. To understand the verse better, it's helpful to provide some context. In Genesis chapter 14 verse 8, we learn that a group of kings waged war against 5 other kings, including the kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela, also known as Zoar. These 5 kings were located in the region of the Jordan Valley, specifically in the Vale of Siddim. The conflict arose when the 5 kings rebelled against the 4 kings who had dominated them for 12 years. The 4 kings, led by Chedorlaomer, launched an expedition to suppress the rebellion and bring the 5 kings back into submission. Verse 8 describes the response of the kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela Zoar to the threat. They mobilized their forces and went out to engage in battle with the invading kings in the Vale of Siddim. This verse sets the stage for the ensuing battle and the subsequent events in the chapter. It introduces the conflict between these kings and highlights the bravery or audacity of the kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela in opposing the 4 invading kings. This passage demonstrates the political and military context of the time, showing the conflicts and alliances between various city-states and kingdoms in the region. It also serves as a prelude to the events that follow, including the capture of Lot, Abraham's nephew, by the invading kings and Abraham's subsequent rescue mission. Overall, Genesis chapter 14 verse 8 provides essential context for understanding the narrative in Genesis 14 and the challenges faced by Abraham and the kings of the region. It sets the stage for the dramatic events that unfold in subsequent verses and highlights the valor of the kings who went out to engage in battle. Genesis chapter 14 verse 9. With Chedorlaomer the king of Elam, and with Tidal king of nations, and Amraphel king of Shinar, and Arioch king of Elazar, 4 kings with 5. Context: Genesis chapter 14 is an account of a battle between several kings in the region. It tells the story of how 4 kings, led by Chedorlaomer, waged war against 5 other kings, including the king of Sodom. Abram, later known as Abraham, becomes involved in this conflict when his nephew Lot is captured. The significance of the kings: the verse mentions the names of 4 kings, Chedorlaomer, Tidal, Amraphel, and Arioch. These kings formed an alliance and went to war against the 5 kings of the cities in the Jordan Valley. It is interesting to note that Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam, was the leader of this confederation. Elam was an ancient civilization in the region that corresponds to modern-day Iran. The battle and Abram's involvement. The context of this verse reveals that Chedorlaomer and his allies had conquered several cities and had taken Lot, Abram's nephew, captive. When Abram learned about Lot's capture, he gathered a small force of his own servants, pursued the enemy kings, and successfully rescued Lot along with the other captives. Spiritual lessons: protection and deliverance. Abram's actions demonstrate his willingness to protect his family and the courage to take action. Likewise, God desires to protect and deliver His people from the hands of their enemies. This story reminds us that God is our ultimate protector and deliverer in times of trouble. Courage and faith. Abram's decision to engage in battle against powerful kings required faith and trust in God. It took great courage to go against such odds, but Abram believed that God would be with him. This story teaches us the importance of having faith in God's promises and stepping out in courage, even when faced with difficult circumstances. God's sovereignty. The verse emphasizes the involvement of various kings in this battle. However, behind the scenes, it is clear that God is orchestrating events to fulfill His purposes. This passage reminds us that God is in control of the affairs of the world, even when it seems like chaos reigns. His sovereignty extends to all aspects of life, and we can trust in His ultimate plan. Application. Trust in God's protection. When faced with challenging situations or enemies, we can find comfort in knowing that God is our protector. We can rely on Him and seek His guidance and deliverance. Courage to step out in faith. Like Abram, we should trust God's promises and have the courage to step out in faith, even when faced with daunting circumstances. God is faithful, and He will provide for us and guide us as we trust in Him. Acknowledging God's sovereignty. It is essential to remember that God is sovereign over all things. Even when things seem chaotic or out of control, we can trust that God is working out His plan for our lives and for the world. Remember, Genesis chapter 14 verse 9 is just one verse in a larger narrative. It is beneficial to study the entire chapter and explore the surrounding verses to gain a deeper understanding of the context and the lessons it offers. Genesis chapter 14 verse 10. And the vale of Siddim was full of slime pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, and fell there, and they that remained fled to the mountain. In this verse, we find a description of the events that took place during a battle involving the kings of several cities, including Sodom and Gomorrah. To fully understand the context of Genesis chapter 14 verse 10, it is helpful to provide a brief overview of the preceding verses. Genesis chapter 14 recounts the account of a regional conflict between several kings. These kings included Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elazar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations. They waged war against 5 other kings, including the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. In verse 10, we are introduced to the location of the battle, the Vale of Siddim. The phrase, Vale of Siddim, refers to a valley in the region of the Dead Sea. It was an area known for its abundance of slime pits. These pits were natural occurrences where sticky, tar-like substances would seep out from the ground, making the terrain difficult to navigate. The presence of slime pits would have made it challenging for armies to maneuver and fight effectively. During the battle, the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, along with their forces, were overwhelmed. They were defeated by the opposing kings, causing them to flee. As they fled, some of them fell into the slime pits, while others managed to escape to the safety of the nearby mountains. The events described in this verse serve as a precursor to the subsequent narrative in which Abram, later known as Abraham, enters the scene to rescue his nephew Lot, who had been taken captive during the conflict. Abram's intervention leads to a significant encounter with Melchizedek, the king of Salem, who blesses Abram and receives a tithe from him. Overall, Genesis chapter 14 verse 10 highlights the perilous circumstances faced by the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah during their battle against the invading kings. It also provides geographical context, depicting the treacherous terrain of the Vale of Siddim, which played a role in the outcome of the conflict. Genesis chapter 14 verse 11. And they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah, and all their victuals, and went their way. Genesis chapter 14 verse 11 is part of the narrative that describes an event known as the War of the Kings. This war occurred in the early chapters of Genesis when a coalition of kings waged war against a group of rebel kings, including the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah. To understand the significance of this verse, it's helpful to provide some context. In Genesis chapter 14, we learn that several kings formed an alliance and waged war against a group of kings, including the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. The rebels, including the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, were defeated, and their cities were plundered by the victors. In verse 11, it states, "And they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah, and all their victuals, and went their way." Here, we see that the victorious kings seized the possessions and resources of Sodom and Gomorrah. The goods refer to their material wealth, such as possessions, livestock, and valuable items. The term victuals refers to the food supplies and provisions of the cities. This verse emphasizes the consequences of war and the impact it had on the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. The looting of the goods and victuals reveals the devastating aftermath of the conflict. It serves as a reminder of the temporal nature of material possessions and the vulnerability of human accomplishments. From a broader perspective, this passage also connects to the themes of justice and judgment found in the biblical narrative. Sodom and Gomorrah were infamous for their wickedness, particularly in the areas of sexual immorality and societal corruption. The destruction and looting of their cities can be seen as a form of divine judgment upon their sinful practices. This verse also sets the stage for the subsequent events in Genesis chapter 14, where Abram, later known as Abraham, pursues the victorious kings to rescue his nephew Lot, who had been taken captive. Abram gathers a small army and successfully defeats the enemy kings, recovering all the plunder and rescuing the captives. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 14 verse 11 highlights the consequences of the War of the Kings, specifically the looting of the goods and victuals of Sodom and Gomorrah by the victorious kings. This verse serves as a reminder of the temporal nature of material possessions and the judgment that can come upon societies engulfed in wickedness. Genesis chapter 14 verse 12. And they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. Genesis chapter 14 verse 12 is part of the larger narrative of the war between 4 kings and 5 kings. In this verse, we learn that after the 4 kings had conquered Sodom and Gomorrah, they took captive Lot, who was the nephew of Abram, later known as Abraham. They also seized Lot's possessions and left the area. This verse serves as a pivotal point in the story, highlighting the importance of Lot and his connection to Abram. It sets the stage for Abram's subsequent actions as he prepares to rescue Lot. Now, let's explore the broader context of this verse to better understand its significance within the book of Genesis. In Genesis chapter 14, we find that a coalition of 4 kings led by Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam, launched an attack on the cities of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela, also known as Zoar. These 5 cities were ruled by 5 kings, including the king of Sodom. During the battle, the 4 kings defeated the 5 kings, plundered the cities, and took captives, including Lot. Lot had chosen to settle near Sodom, which eventually led to his capture when the city fell under attack. Upon hearing about Lot's capture, Abram mustered his forces and embarked on a daring rescue mission. With a well-trained and equipped group of 318 men born in his household, Abram pursued the captors and successfully defeated them, liberating Lot and his belongings. Genesis chapter 14 verse 14 to 16. This event not only demonstrates Abram's bravery and military prowess but also emphasizes his loyalty and concern for his family. It also underscores the difference between Abram and his nephew Lot in terms of their character and choices. Lot's decision to settle near Sodom, a city known for its wickedness, eventually led to his capture. In contrast, Abram's faith in God and his obedience had positioned him for blessings and protection. Through this narrative, we can observe the consequences of Lot's worldly choices and the contrast between him and Abram. This verse also sets the stage for the interaction between Abram and Melchizedek, the king of Salem and a priest of God Most High, which occurs in the subsequent verses, Genesis chapter 14 verse 17 to 24. Melchizedek blesses Abram, and Abram offers him a tithe of the spoils of war, acknowledging Melchizedek's priesthood. In summary, Genesis chapter 14 verse 12 highlights the capture of Lot and his possessions by the 4 kings who defeated Sodom and Gomorrah. It serves as a turning point in the narrative, leading Abram to mobilize his forces and rescue Lot. This event underscores the divergent paths chosen by Abram and Lot, highlighting Abram's faith and loyalty to family. Genesis chapter 14 verse 13. And there came one that had escaped, and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, and brother of Anna, and these were confederate with Abram. Genesis chapter 14 recounts a significant event in the life of Abram, who would later be known as Abraham. In this chapter, a regional conflict takes place involving several kings and their armies. Abram's nephew Lot, along with his possessions, is captured during this conflict, prompting Abram to intervene. In Genesis chapter 14 verse 13, we see that Abram receives news of the situation from one that had escaped. This individual identifies Abram as the Hebrew, emphasizing Abram's identity among the people of that time. The mention of Abram dwelling in the plain of Mamre, which belonged to the Amorites, highlights the geographical context of the story. The verse further mentions 2 individuals, Eshcol and Anna, who are described as brothers of Mamre the Amorite. These 3 men were confederate with Abram, implying a close alliance or friendship. Their connection becomes significant as the story unfolds, as they play a role in assisting Abram. This verse sets the stage for Abram's subsequent actions, as he embarks on a daring rescue mission to deliver Lot and defeat the enemy kings. It showcases Abram's courage, loyalty, and military prowess. Overall, Genesis chapter 14 verse 13 provides important details regarding the background of the story, highlighting Abram's status as a Hebrew and his alliance with the Amorites. It sets the context for the subsequent events and emphasizes the relationships that Abram had cultivated in the land. Genesis chapter 14 verse 14. And when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. Genesis chapter 14 verse 14 is part of the account of Abram, later known as Abraham, and his response to a conflict involving his nephew Lot. This verse provides insights into Abram's character and actions during a challenging situation. In this chapter, several kings engage in warfare, and Lot, along with his possessions, is captured and taken captive. Upon hearing this news, Abram takes immediate action. We can draw some key points from this verse. Abram's concern for his family. Abram's brother is Lot's father, and upon learning that his nephew had been captured, Abram was deeply troubled. This verse reveals Abram's strong family ties and his willingness to take risks to protect his loved ones. Abram's preparedness. Abram promptly prepares for battle. He arms his trained servants, who were born in his own house. The mention of trained servants implies that Abram was not only a man of wealth and possessions but also someone who had a disciplined and organized household. This demonstrates Abram's foresight and his ability to assemble a force quickly when the need arises. Abram's pursuit. Abram leads his trained servants, numbering 318, in pursuit of those who had taken Lot captive. This emphasizes Abram's determination and bravery. Despite potentially facing a superior force, he decides to engage the enemy to rescue his nephew. It's worth noting that Abram's actions in this passage provide a glimpse into his character as a righteous and protective figure. He is known for his faith in God, and his response to this crisis showcases his trust in God's promises. Later in the narrative, Abram encounters Melchizedek, the priest of God Most High, who blesses him, further reinforcing Abram's righteousness and devotion to God. In summary, Genesis chapter 14 verse 14 highlights Abram's deep concern for his family, his preparedness, and his courage in pursuing and rescuing his nephew Lot. It serves as a testament to Abram's character and faith in God's providence. Genesis chapter 14 verse 15. And he divided himself against them, he and his servants, by night, and smote them, and pursued them unto Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. Historical context. Genesis chapter 14 is set in a time when various kings and nations were engaged in conflicts and battles. This chapter specifically describes a war between 4 kings and 5 kings, involving several city-states in the region of Sodom and Gomorrah. Key characters. Abram, later known as Abraham, he plays a significant role in this verse. Abram had a small army of trained servants and allies, and he launched a strategic attack during the night against the armies of the 4 kings who had captured his nephew, Lot. He was Abram's nephew who had settled near Sodom. During the war, Lot was taken captive by the invading kings, which led to Abram's intervention. Abram's action. In this verse, we see Abram dividing his forces and launching a surprise attack against the armies of the 4 kings. With his servants, Abram defeated the enemy forces, rescued Lot, and pursued the enemy as far as Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. Lessons and themes. Courage and leadership. Abram's actions demonstrate his courage, leadership, and military skills. Despite having a smaller force, he was willing to confront the enemy to rescue his nephew. God's faithfulness. Throughout the narrative of Abram, we see God's faithfulness and protection. God had promised to bless Abram and make him a great nation, and he continually intervened to ensure the fulfillment of those promises. Protection of family. Abram's intervention to rescue Lot highlights the importance of protecting and caring for our family members. It shows Abram's love and concern for his nephew, reflecting the value of familial relationships. Strategic thinking. Abram's decision to divide his forces and launch a surprise attack at night showcases strategic thinking and planning. It serves as a reminder of the importance of wisdom and careful consideration when facing challenges. Application: trust in God's promises. Just as God was faithful to Abram, we can trust in God's promises for our lives. He is with us in our battles, and He can provide us with the strength and wisdom needed to overcome obstacles. Protecting and caring for others, we should follow Abram's example by looking out for the well-being of our family and loved ones. It is our responsibility to support and protect them when they are in need. Demonstrating courage and leadership, when faced with difficulties or conflicts, we can draw inspiration from Abram's courage and leadership. By relying on God's guidance, we can make wise decisions and take appropriate action. Strategic thinking. Abram's strategic approach to the battle teaches us the importance of wise planning and decision-making. It reminds us to seek wisdom and consider all available options before taking action in our own lives. Remember, as you study the Bible, it is beneficial to read the surrounding verses and consult commentaries or study materials to gain a deeper understanding of the passage and its context. Genesis chapter 14 verse 16. And he brought back all the goods, and also brought again his brother Lot, and his goods, and the women also, and the people. This verse is part of the account of Abram, later known as Abraham, and his role in a conflict involving several kings. Let's delve into the context and significance of Genesis chapter 14 verse 16. In Genesis 14, we find that a group of kings went to war against each other. Among the captives taken during this conflict was Lot, who was Abram's nephew. When Abram heard about Lot's capture, he mustered his own forces, comprising 318 trained men from his household, and pursued the enemy kings. Verse 16 describes the outcome of Abram's rescue mission. After engaging in battle with the enemy forces, Abram was successful in defeating them and rescuing Lot, along with all the captives and their possessions. The verse highlights the comprehensive nature of Abram's victory, as it states that he brought back all the goods, and also recovered his brother Lot, along with Lot's belongings. Furthermore, Abram ensured the safe return of the women and the people who had been captured. This verse demonstrates Abram's bravery and determination to protect his family. It showcases his military prowess and leadership skills as he successfully rescues his nephew and the other captives. Abram's actions in this account foreshadow his future role as the father of a great nation, as promised by God. From a spiritual perspective, we can draw several lessons from this verse. Firstly, it emphasizes the importance of familial relationships. Abram's love and concern for his nephew led him to take immediate action to rescue Lot. This teaches us the significance of caring for and supporting our family members in times of need. Secondly, Abram's victory in rescuing the captives illustrates the concept of justice and righteousness. He fought against oppression and injustice, aligning himself with the righteous cause. This reminds us of the importance of standing up for what is right and defending those who are oppressed or vulnerable. Lastly, this verse can also be seen as a precursor to the concept of redemption found throughout the Bible. Abram's actions mirror God's desire to redeem and restore his people. Just as Abram brought back the captives and their possessions, God seeks to bring redemption and restoration to humanity through His love and grace, ultimately exemplified through the person of Jesus Christ. In summary, Genesis chapter 14 verse 16 recounts Abram's victorious rescue of Lot and the other captives, along with their possessions. This verse emphasizes the significance of familial relationships, the importance of justice and righteousness, and foreshadows the concept of redemption that is prevalent throughout the Bible. Genesis chapter 14 verse 17. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer, and of the kings that were with him, at the valley of Shaveh, which is the king's dale. This verse is a part of the narrative in Genesis chapter 14 that describes the events following Abram's rescue of his nephew Lot, who had been taken captive by a coalition of kings led by Chedorlaomer. After defeating the kings and freeing Lot and the other captives, Abram embarked on a victorious return. In Genesis chapter 14 verse 17, we encounter the mention of two kings, the king of Sodom and the king of Salem. Let's explore the significance of these encounters and their implications in the broader context of the chapter. The king of Sodom. The verse states that the king of Sodom went out to meet Abram upon his return. It is important to note that the city of Sodom was known for its wickedness, Genesis chapter 13 verse 13, and its inhabitants were engaging in various sins. However, despite the moral decay of the city, the king of Sodom is still recognized as a figure of authority. The Valley of Shaveh. The meeting between Abram and the king of Sodom takes place at the Valley of Shaveh, also known as the King's Dale. The Valley of Shaveh is not mentioned elsewhere in the Bible, and its exact location is uncertain. However, its mention in this verse indicates it was a known location during the time of Abram. Melchizedek, the king of Salem. Immediately following this encounter, in Genesis chapter 14 verse 18 to 20, we read about another significant meeting. Melchizedek, the king of Salem, comes forward to meet Abram. He brings bread and wine and blesses Abram, acknowledging God's role in Abram's victory. Melchizedek is described as a priest of God Most High and blesses Abram in the name of God. The encounter with Melchizedek is notable because it highlights a distinct contrast between the king of Sodom and Melchizedek. While the king of Sodom represents the sinful and corrupt city, Melchizedek, as a priest of God, symbolizes righteousness and godly authority. This encounter also sets the stage for an important interaction in the subsequent verses. Abram offers a tithe, a tenth of his spoils, to Melchizedek as an act of worship and gratitude. This demonstrates Abram's recognition of Melchizedek's spiritual authority and his acknowledgement of God's provision and blessing. In summary, Genesis chapter 14 verse 17 marks the meeting between Abram and the king of Sodom at the Valley of Shaveh, after Abram's victorious return. This encounter, along with the subsequent meeting with Melchizedek, highlights the contrast between worldly authority represented by the king of Sodom and godly authority embodied by Melchizedek. It underscores the importance of recognizing and aligning with godly authority, and it sets the stage for Abram's act of worship and gratitude through the offering of a tithe. Genesis chapter 14 verse 18. And Melchizedek king of Salem brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. This verse is part of the account of Abram, later known as Abraham, and his encounter with Melchizedek, the king of Salem. Let's delve into this verse and explore its significance in the broader biblical context. Melchizedek. Melchizedek is an intriguing figure in the Bible. He is mentioned in only a few verses, primarily in Genesis chapter 14 and Psalm chapter 110, but his significance is profound. The name Melchizedek means king of righteousness, and he is described as the king of Salem, which is believed to be an early name for Jerusalem. He is also identified as a priest of the Most High God. Bread and wine. In this verse, Melchizedek brings forth bread and wine. Bread and wine hold symbolic significance in the Bible. Bread often represents sustenance, provision, and nourishment. It can also point to the body of Christ, as Jesus referred to himself as the bread of life in the New Testament, John chapter 6 verse 35. Wine, on the other hand, is associated with joy, celebration, and in the context of the New Testament, it represents the blood of Jesus shed for the forgiveness of sins. Matthew chapter 26 verse 26 to verse 28. The bread and wine brought forth by Melchizedek can be seen as a foreshadowing of the communion, a practice established by Jesus with his disciples. Priest of the Most High God. Melchizedek is described as a priest of the Most High God. This title is significant because it predates the establishment of the Levitical priesthood in the Mosaic Law. The book of Hebrews in the New Testament draws upon the example of Melchizedek to explain the superiority of Jesus' priesthood. In Hebrews chapter 7, Melchizedek is portrayed as a type or foreshadowing of Christ, who is described as a high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. The fact that Abram, the father of the Israelite nation, recognized and interacted with Melchizedek indicates that there was a knowledge and worship of the true God outside of the chosen nation of Israel. Relationship between Abram and Melchizedek. In the preceding verses of Genesis chapter 14, Abram rescues his nephew Lot and defeats several kings who had captured him. After this victorious battle, Melchizedek appears to Abram and blesses him. Abram responds by giving Melchizedek a tithe, a tenth of all the spoils of war. This act signifies recognition of Melchizedek's authority and priesthood. It also demonstrates Abram's acknowledgement that the blessings and victory he experienced were ultimately from God. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 14 verse 18 introduces us to Melchizedek, a mysterious figure who served as both king and priest. His encounter with Abram holds profound significance, foreshadowing aspects of the person and work of Jesus Christ, who is the ultimate fulfillment of Melchizedek's priesthood. This passage highlights the existence of true worshippers of the Most High God outside of the Israelite nation and emphasizes the faith and recognition of God's authority displayed by Abram. Genesis chapter 14 verse 19. And he blessed him, and said, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. In this verse, we find Abram, who later becomes known as Abraham, encountering Melchizedek, the king of Salem and a priest of the Most High God. This encounter takes place after Abram successfully rescues his nephew Lot, who had been captured by a coalition of kings. Context. To understand the significance of this verse, let's consider the context of Genesis chapter 14. In this chapter, we see a battle among several kings in the region. Abram, along with a few hundred men, defeats the opposing armies and rescues Lot. After this victory, Melchizedek comes out to meet Abram and blesses him. The blessing, Melchizedek's blessing on Abram, is a significant event. He acknowledges Abram as blessed, and attributes this blessing to the Most High God. This blessing carries weight and authority, as it comes from a priest-king who serves the one true God. Melchizedek recognizes God's sovereignty over heaven and earth and acknowledges him as the ultimate possessor of all things. Melchizedek is an intriguing figure in the Bible, appearing in only a few verses. He is described as the king of Salem, which later becomes Jerusalem, and a priest of the Most High God. Melchizedek's name means king of righteousness, and he is also referred to as the king of peace, Hebrews chapter 7 verse 2. He emerges suddenly in the narrative, without any genealogical background, and his priesthood predates the Levitical priesthood established later in the Mosaic law. Foreshadowing Jesus Christ, Melchizedek's appearance and interaction with Abram have symbolic significance, especially in light of the New Testament. The book of Hebrews extensively references Melchizedek and draws parallels between him and Jesus Christ. Melchizedek's priesthood is seen as a foreshadowing of Jesus's eternal priesthood, transcending the Levitical priesthood that operated under the Mosaic law, Hebrews chapter 7 verse 1 to 10. The fact that Melchizedek blesses Abram, who is a forefather of Jesus according to the flesh, highlights the connection between the Old Testament and the coming Messiah. Abram's response. In the following verses, Genesis chapter 14 verse 20 to 24, Abram responds to Melchizedek's blessing by giving him a tenth of everything. This act of tithing demonstrates Abram's recognition of Melchizedek's authority and Abram's gratitude for the victory that God has given him. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 14 verse 19 highlights the encounter between Abram and Melchizedek, where Melchizedek blesses Abram and acknowledges the sovereignty of the Most High God. This event carries symbolic significance in relation to Jesus Christ, portraying Melchizedek's priesthood as a precursor to Jesus's eternal priesthood. It also emphasizes the faith and gratitude of Abram, who responds by offering a tithe. Genesis chapter 14 verse 20, And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand. And he gave him tithes of all. This verse is part of the account of Abram, later known as Abraham, after he successfully rescues his nephew Lot and his possessions from captivity by several kings who had raided Sodom and Gomorrah. After his victory, Abram encounters Melchizedek, who is described as the king of Salem and a priest of God. Melchizedek blesses Abram and Abram responds by giving him a tithe, a tenth of all the spoils of war. Here are a few key points to consider in a Bible study of Genesis chapter 14 verse 20. Acknowledgement of God's deliverance. In this verse, Abram acknowledges that it is God, the Most High, who has delivered his enemies into his hand. It highlights Abram's recognition that his victory was not achieved solely by his own strength or military prowess but was a result of God's intervention and assistance. Blessing from the Most High God. Abram blesses and acknowledges God, giving credit and honor to him for the victory. This response shows Abram's faith in God's sovereignty and his role as the source of blessing and provision. Giving a tithe. Abram gives a tenth of all the spoils of war to Melchizedek. The act of tithing was a practice of giving a portion of one's income or possessions as an offering to God or to religious leaders. In this case, Abram's tithe is a gesture of gratitude and recognition of Melchizedek's spiritual authority and connection to God. Significance of Melchizedek. Melchizedek is an intriguing figure in the Bible. He is described as both a king and a priest, which is a unique combination. His name means King of Righteousness, and he is the King of Salem, which means peace. Melchizedek is seen as a type or foreshadowing of Christ, the ultimate king and high priest. The New Testament book of Hebrews draws upon Melchizedek's example to illustrate the superiority of Christ's priesthood. Overall, Genesis chapter 14 verse 20 emphasizes Abram's acknowledgement of God's role in his victory, his act of giving a tithe in response to God's blessing, and the appearance of Melchizedek as a significant figure in Abram's life. It invites us to reflect on the themes of gratitude, acknowledging God's provision, and the significance of Christ's priesthood. Genesis chapter 14 verse 21. And the king of Sodom said unto Abram, Give me the persons, and take the goods to thyself. This verse is part of the account of Abram's encounter with the king of Sodom after his successful rescue of his nephew Lot, who had been captured by an alliance of kings. To understand the significance of this verse, let's examine the broader context of the story. In Genesis chapter 14, we learn that several kings waged war against Sodom and its neighboring cities, including Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela or Zoar. These cities were engaged in rebellion against a coalition of kings led by Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam. During the battle, Sodom and Gomorrah were defeated, and Lot, who was living in Sodom, was taken captive along with his possessions. Upon receiving news of Lot's capture, Abram, who would later be renamed Abraham, gathered a force of 318 trained men from his own household and pursued the victorious kings. With a well-executed strategy, Abram rescued Lot and recovered all the possessions and people that had been taken, including the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah. In Genesis chapter 14 verse 17 to verse 20, we see that after Abram's victorious return, he encountered two significant figures, Melchizedek, the king of Salem and a priest of God, and the king of Sodom. Melchizedek blessed Abram and Abram gave him a tenth of all the spoils as an offering. Following this encounter, the king of Sodom approached Abram and made the statement recorded in Genesis chapter 14 verse 21, And the king of Sodom said unto Abram, Give me the persons, and take the goods to thyself. The king of Sodom requested the return of the people who had been taken captive, but he offered Abram to keep the recovered possessions. Abram's response to the king of Sodom is recorded in the subsequent verses. In Genesis chapter 14 verse 22 to verse 24, Abram made a solemn oath before God that he would not take anything belonging to the king of Sodom, neither a thread nor a sandal strap, so that the king could not say he made Abram rich. Abram wanted to maintain his integrity before God and did not want any potential future conflicts or accusations from the king of Sodom. Instead, he insisted on giving back the goods to their rightful owners, including the share of spoils that belonged to his allies who had accompanied him in the rescue mission. This verse highlights Abram's commitment to honesty, integrity, and his trust in God as the ultimate provider and source of blessings. By refusing any personal gain from the king of Sodom, Abram demonstrated his faithfulness and dependence on God's promises rather than compromising his values for temporary material gain. In summary, Genesis chapter 14 verse 21 captures the request made by the king of Sodom to Abram, who had just returned victorious from the rescue mission. Abram's response emphasizes his commitment to integrity and his unwavering faith in God's provision and blessings. It serves as a reminder of the importance of staying true to one's principles, even when faced with tempting offers or compromises. Genesis chapter 14 verse 22. And Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth. Context: in Genesis 14, we find the account of a battle between several kings. Abram, later known as Abraham, learns that his nephew Lot, along with his possessions, has been taken captive. In response, Abram gathers his trained servants and defeats the kings, rescuing Lot and recovering the goods. After the victory, Abram encounters the king of Sodom, and it is in this context that he speaks the words of Genesis chapter 14 verse 22. Abram's acknowledgement of God. Abram acknowledges the Lord, the Most High God, as the possessor of heaven and earth. This statement reflects Abram's recognition of God's sovereignty and authority over all creation. Abram attributes the victory in battle to the Lord, acknowledging him as the ultimate source of his success. Lift up mine hand. The phrase, I have lifted up mine hand, is an idiomatic expression used to affirm an oath or make a solemn promise. By lifting up his hand, Abram is making a gesture symbolizing his commitment and giving his word in the presence of God. It signifies a binding oath, indicating that Abram is making a promise to the Lord. Abram's loyalty to God. Abram's words reveal his loyalty to God. Rather than accepting the spoils of war offered by the king of Sodom, Abram affirms his devotion to God alone. He wants to ensure that no one can accuse him of profiting from any human source or give the impression that he owes anything to the king of Sodom. Abram wants it to be clear that his success and blessings come from God alone. Application: Genesis chapter 14 verse 22 reminds us of the importance of acknowledging God as the source of our victories and blessings. It teaches us to give credit where it is due and to remain faithful to God, even in times of success. We should be careful not to compromise our allegiance to Him by seeking gains or recognition from worldly sources. Instead, we should trust in God's provision and give Him the glory for all He has done in our lives. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 14 verse 22 highlights Abram's acknowledgement of God's sovereignty and his commitment to the Lord as the possessor of heaven and earth. It serves as a reminder for us to recognize and honor God as the source of our blessings and to remain loyal to Him in all circumstances. Genesis chapter 14 verse 23, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis chapter 14, which describes the events surrounding Abram, later known as Abraham, after he rescues his nephew Lot from captivity. After defeating a coalition of kings who had taken Lot captive, Abram encounters the king of Sodom and Melchizedek, the king of Salem and a priest of God Most High. In Genesis chapter 14 verse 22 through 23, Abram responds to the king of Sodom's offer, expressing his refusal to take any material possessions or rewards from the spoils of war. He declares that he will not take even a thread or shoe latchet from the king of Sodom to prevent any possibility of the king claiming credit for making Abram rich. This verse highlights several important aspects of Abram's character and faith, providing valuable lessons for us today: integrity and humility. Abram's refusal to accept any reward or wealth from the king of Sodom demonstrates his commitment to integrity and his humility before God. He acknowledges that it is God who has blessed him and granted him victory in battle, and he does not want anyone else to claim credit for his success. Trust in God's provision. By rejecting material gain, Abram displays his trust in God's provision. He understands that his blessings come from God and that relying on God's provision is far more important than acquiring wealth through worldly means. This attitude is a powerful reminder for us to prioritize our trust in God rather than seeking material gain as the ultimate measure of success. Avoiding temptation. Abram's decision not to accept any spoils of war from the king of Sodom also reflects his wisdom in avoiding potential temptation. He recognizes that accepting material possessions from a morally compromised source could potentially compromise his own faith and relationship with God. It serves as a reminder for us to be cautious about the sources and influences we allow into our lives, choosing to align ourselves with godly principles. Setting an example. Abram's firm stance against receiving any reward sets an example for others. It demonstrates the importance of living with integrity and prioritizing spiritual values over worldly gains. Abram's decision serves as a challenge for us to examine our own motivations and actions, ensuring that we prioritize our faith and righteousness above personal gain. In summary, Genesis chapter 14 verse 23 captures Abram's resolute refusal to accept any material rewards or wealth from the king of Sodom. It reflects his integrity, trust in God's provision, avoidance of temptation, and setting an example for others. This verse reminds us of the importance of prioritizing spiritual values and living with integrity in our own lives. Genesis chapter 14 verse 24. Save only that which the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men which went with me, Anna, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them take their portion. Context. Genesis chapter 14 recounts the account of a war between several kings in the region of Sodom and Gomorrah. During the conflict, Lot, the nephew of Abraham, was taken captive along with his possessions by the invading kings. When Abraham heard about this, he gathered a group of 318 trained men and pursued the captors, eventually defeating them and rescuing Lot and his belongings. Analysis. In verse 24, we find Abraham's response to the king of Sodom, who had come out to meet him after his victory. The king of Sodom wanted to reward Abraham for his bravery and offered him all the recovered goods. However, Abraham declined the offer and made a specific request: save only that which the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men which went with me, Anna, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them take their portion. Abraham's refusal. Abraham refused to accept any rewards or possessions from the king of Sodom. This decision reveals Abraham's trust in God's provision rather than relying on the wealth and power of the king. He didn't want the king to take credit for making him rich. Concern for his allies. Abraham requested that only the portion belonging to his young men and the men who accompanied him, Anna, Eshcol, and Mamre, should be taken. This shows Abraham's integrity and fairness. He didn't want his allies to be overlooked or disadvantaged after their participation in the rescue mission. Faith in God's provision. Abraham's refusal of the rewards and his focus on the welfare of his allies demonstrate his deep trust in God. He believed that God, who had promised to bless him, would provide for him and his descendants without compromising his integrity or aligning himself with unrighteousness. Lessons. From this verse, we can draw a few lessons. Trust in God's provision. Abraham's actions remind us to place our trust in God's provision rather than relying solely on material possessions or the help of others. God is our ultimate source of blessing and provision. Integrity and fairness. Abraham's concern for his allies teaches us the importance of integrity and fairness in our dealings with others. We should not neglect or exploit those who have contributed to our success or well-being. Prioritizing God's glory. By refusing the king's rewards, Abraham prioritized giving glory to God rather than seeking personal gain or human recognition. We should also prioritize honoring God and seeking His approval rather than worldly rewards. Seeking God's will. Abraham's decision was guided by his desire to align with God's will and purposes. As believers, we should seek God's guidance and make choices that align with His principles and teachings. Overall, Genesis chapter 14 verse 24 highlights Abraham's trust in God's provision, his integrity, and his desire to prioritize God's glory. It challenges us to examine our own priorities, trust in God's provision, and seek to live with integrity and fairness in our interactions with others.